2 terms as president. There is no higher honor in American politics, and scant competition even when looking at the global stage. Those who win and live out their 2 terms often attain a mythological status, titans who no opponent could stop. Yet, these people are all human at the end of the day. They had to build their profile brick by brick in order to gain the fame needed to run. Today, we tell the story of the Titan Slayers, men who met these giants on the road to success and defeated them. We'll start early in the history of the United States. The position of presidency was effectively created for Washington, and he never really had a chance to lose. The other unchallenged president was not so lucky. The year was 1789. The United States had just conducted its first presidential election ever, and General George Washington was to serve as the first president from March 4th. In accordance with this, the first congressional elections were taking place. The first proto-parties were already in place, Federalists who supported the new Constitution and Anti-Federalists who wanted to weaken or change the Constitution. Future President James Madison, a Federalist who had significant influence on the Constitution and especially the direct election of representatives, was standing in the 5th Congressional District of Virginia. Despite the district being drawn unfavorably with many anti-Federalist counties, Madison ran regardless, believing that he could win despite the district's makeup. His opponent was the aforementioned James Monroe, an anti-Federalist at the time. The primary issue here was the Bill of Rights, or well, the non-existence of the Bill of Rights. Many constitutional skeptics wanted it added and ratified as soon as possible. Now, interestingly, they held straight up debates for this election, including in freezing weather, which caused Madison to get a frostbite scar on his nose. The election was a pretty strange one in general, and not the least because of how little genuine animosity there seemed to be between these two dudes. The two future presidents apparently traveled together and slept in the same room. Interesting. Madison also had several mishaps, with supporters getting dudes to come turn out at the polls, and then they magically had a backstory that made them owe something to Monroe, namely their vote. Nevertheless, Madison ended up winning 57 to 43%. These men remained friends after the election, and Monroe would eventually serve as Secretary of State under Madison, before then becoming president. You know what they say, love wins. Also, Monroe tried again in 1790 and got like 3% of the vote. What a loser. As many of you probably know, Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas contested the same Senate seat in 1858, with Lincoln ultimately losing but overperforming and thus furthering his career for his future presidential run. I wanted to at least mention this, but it doesn't count for this video because it was a vote of the Illinois legislature, not a proper measure of the popular will. As such, I will not be considering Douglas a proper Titan Slayer, doubly so because how dismal his performance in 1860 ended up being. Rest well, Short King. William McKinley is a very interesting case for the topic of this video, being a giant who was slain multiple times but not necessarily cleanly or fairly, and then he got slain in real life, but that's beside the point. He had a very long and storied career in the U.S. House, being gerrymandered out of his seat, winning some of those gerrymandered districts, but losing a few times in 1882 and 1890, with the latter partially being because of his unpopular McKinley tariff. Thus, it's hard to say whether his opponents can really be called Titan Slayers. We've had a short stretch of technical disqualifications, but we're going to be back on track with actual Slayers, now with McKinley's immediate successor. Despite his crazy fast and unexpected rise to the presidency, Theodore Roosevelt did indeed lose an election before becoming president. What's fascinating about this election is that he wasn't even the most interesting candidate running. In the year 1886, New York was to have yet another mayoral election. In the Democratic corner was Abraham Hewitt, a fairly unremarkable candidate whose only real claim to fame was being the son of Peter Cooper, the man with the greatest beard of any presidential candidate. He would end up winning and becoming a Titan Slayer, but Roosevelt was hardly his main foe this election. That title would go to Henry George, founder of Georgism, inventor of the land value tax. The fact that this dude almost became mayor of New York is genuinely nuts. The election was mostly viewed as a contest between the moderates in the Democratic camp and the more radical Georgists who backed old Henry for mayor. Ultimately, land value tax can fix many things, but it can't fix an election, because tactical voting from the Republican side secured the office for Hewitt. Roosevelt, despite being despondent after his loss and believing his career to be over, would eventually rise back up to power and fame. Well, if we discount 1912, but the Republican dominance between the Civil War and Great Depression would end up proving very fruitful for our Titan Slayers, as after the 2 terms of undefeated Wilson would come Warren G. Harding. Though he never had the chance to serve 2 terms, it's almost certain he would have won another term even with his corruption scandal, and so I am including him in this video. After a short stint as lieutenant governor of Ohio, Harding wanted the real deal and set up a run for governor in 1910. There is unfortunately very little information available on this election. In general, though, this was a strong midterm for Democrats and a general national rejection of the conservative republicanism of Taft in favor of both Democrats and progressive Republicans. Our Titan Slayer here, incumbent Governor Judson Harmon, was a fairly progressive governor who introduced many pro-worker laws. It appears the country was not yet ready for the conservative brand of politics Harding represented, and it would take a world war and failing economy for Harding to once again get his moment in the sun after becoming a senator. Like his predecessor, Coolidge did not win 2 full terms despite serving more than 4 years. But again, given how much of an ass-whooping Hoover gave Al Smith, he would have easily won another term, and thus he counts. Coolidge ran in a lot of elections, and he won most of them, having won 14 elections in his entire career. Despite all that, Mr. You Lose did indeed lose once. In 1905, Coolidge ran for election to the Northampton School Board, despite having 0 children and only having been married for a few weeks. Very little information exists about this election. There was an extremely helpful New York Times article that gave me a ton of information, including the fact that Coolidge's opponent was one John J. Kennedy. The article then goes on to muse that if he had been of the ambitious sort and had had luck on his side, the same qualities that helped him beat Coolidge in a local election might have done the same thing in a state or national election. Who knows? We might have had a President Kennedy, and Calvin Coolidge might be remembered as the man who almost beat Kennedy. As one thinks it over, one must muse about the tricks of human destiny. One may consider the possibility that John J. Kennedy would have made a pretty good president. Like that's ever gonna happen. Roosevelt the Younger's case is a pretty interesting one. For every election he ran on his own merits, he won, with the minor exception of a singular primary. From this lens, apart from that one primary, he seems to be a true titan, with his 4 elections and clean record for every position he ever won the primary for. However, as some of you might know, there is one small blemish on this record. In 1920, the Democratic candidate for president, James Cox, selected FDR as the Democratic running mate that year. According to the FDR library, he was selected for this as a sort of good luck charm, which is a nice way of saying he was selected because he was a Roosevelt. Nevertheless, the nation was not in the mood to elect another Democrat, and the ticket would end up losing in a complete landslide to the previously mentioned Warren G. Harding. Cox and Roosevelt only got 34% of the popular vote, and they had an even worse split in the Electoral College. This one is a borderline case given that Roosevelt really wasn't the driving force behind the loss or the ticket, but it was notable enough to include anyways. We have a fairly huge jump here from FDR all the way to the next Democrat to serve more than one elected term, Bill Clinton. Most of the interim presidents had some circumstance that made them ineligible for this video. Nixon technically only lost in 1960, but that's too notable for me to say anything of substance about it. Other than that, most of the presidents either did not have enough previous experience to lose or didn't serve 2 full terms. That brings us up to Slick Willie, who ran many times in Arkansas before his run for president. The year was 1974 in Arkansas and the rest of America, and incumbent House Republican John Paul Hammerschmidt was in a spot of trouble. The aforementioned Nixon had done a little oopsie, and now the entire country was thinking they might not like Republicans very much. Bill Clinton, fresh out of law school, decided to run, receiving a serious campaign boost when Ford pardoned Nixon and triggered even more backlash. Hammerschmidt, a fairly generic Republican despite being the first one since Reconstruction in Arkansas, also ran a fairly generic campaign, attacking Clinton over his previous support of George McGovern. Ultimately, incumbency pulled through as Clinton lost with 48% of the vote. This was a very respectable result. The segment doesn't end there, though. Despite Clinton's 2 landslides, he actually ended up losing twice in his career. By the year 1980, Clinton had rebounded from his previous loss, being elected Attorney General and then Governor of Arkansas. Now, he was up for re-election. Clinton's trouble started in the primary. He faced a surprisingly tough challenge from turkey farmer Monroe Schwartzlows, perhaps unsurprisingly given how much turkeys like Republicans, and he only won with around 68% of the vote. In the general, Clinton faced attacks over his registration fee for increase for vehicles and the fallout of the Mariel boat lift. His wife also became a campaign issue, as she was still Hillary Rodham, and many Arkansans thought it was uncouth of her to not stick a Clinton on. In the end, Clinton lost to businessman and politician Frank White, who was the first Titan Slayer in this video to oust an incumbent in a fair election. He would go on to have a fairly terrible term, doing little of note other than the creationism law which was overturned by the state courts. He would then go on to lose to Clinton in a landslide when they had a rematch. Man, Titan slaying really isn't what it's cut out to be. Despite a history of his enemies misunderestimating him, George W. Bush did indeed lose an election despite his fairly short list before becoming president. In 1978, the name Bush did not have the same luster it would gain in the 90s. George H.W. Bush was certainly a prominent name in the Republican Party. He had chaired the RNC before and was the current CIA director, but was not yet a former president. Bush the Younger, seeking an entrance into politics, decided to run in Texas's 19th district, where a long-term incumbent was retiring. His opponent would be State Senator Kent Hance. Throughout this campaign, Bush faced the issue of not being seen as a real Texan. He had been Connecticut-born, and to many, he seemed like an outsider swooping in to start his career. After a tough primary win, which was a proxy war between Reagan and Poppy Bush, George would find himself battered by the attacks of Hance, was a born storyteller who could tell yarns that were simply too much for Bush to handle. I've become enamored with Mr. Hands in the making of this video, and I'd like to share some bangers from my favorite of the Titan Slayers. It was a Mercedes. The guy rolled down the window and wanted to know how to get to a certain ranch. Mr. Hands recounted how he'd given the man directions, telling him to turn right after a cattle guard. Then, Mr. Hands continued, he said, "What color uniform will the cattle guard be wearing?" Then there was that TV commercial Mr. Bush dreamed up to demonstrate how energetic he was. It showed him jogging on a track. The only time folks around here go running is when somebody's chasing them. I'm convinced that Bush is going to be beating him, and beat him soundly. I served with Gore, and I know him, and I like him, but I'd hate to ride from Lubbock to Los Angeles with him. If you rode from Lubbock to Los Angeles with Bush, it'd be loads of fun, and Gore'd be saying things like, "I see some mountains." As a quick footnote to this story, Mr. Hens is not only still alive, he is running a fucking podcast. It has 250-ish ratings on Apple Podcasts, so it seems moderately successful. But it's insane anyways that this dude as old as my grandpa is still doing stuff like this. The best storyteller in Texas, indeed. Comment below if you want me to listen to a few episodes of this guy's podcast and do a review. I'm very curious to see what this guy's subjects are about. Last that people will be covering in this video is Obama. Despite his meteoric and nigh mythological rise from obscurity to the presidency, Obama too stumbled once on his path to greatness. In 2000, 38-year-old State Senator Obama decided to challenge Bobby Rush in the primary for Illinois' 1st congressional district. Given how popular Rush was in Obama's obscurity, this was a surprisingly bad decision for how savvy Obama typically was politically. Obama started off with terrible name recognition and was only carrying the white vote in a predominantly black district. To make things worse, Rush's son was shot dead during the campaign, and Obama ended up missing a vote for gun control measures that was introduced in the aftermath of that murder. Rush would end up crushing Obama, getting around 60% of the primary vote to Obama's 30%. Our last Titan Slayer would go on to serve many more terms in that district before ultimately retiring in 2022. While Rush and Obama were never particularly close afterwards, when reflecting on Obama 7 years later, Rush would say that his election to the Senate in 2004 was divinely ordered and God's plan. Thus ends the tale of the Remember what I said about Washington never having a chance to lose? That was true for the USA, but it turns out that Washington's first foray into politics was even before that. In 1755, George sought to be elected to the Virginia House of Burgesses, the legislature of Virginia before independence. The details about this election are fairly murky, but what we do know is that Big G was not yet the hero of the American Revolution, but he had already instigated the French and Indian War. We don't know the details of the campaign, but back then voting wasn't secret and people would campaign by having big barbecues and getting people very drunk. Ultimately, Washington lost big to Hugh West and Thomas Swearingen, making them the first two and arguably the greatest Titan Slayers of all. Thus ends the tale of the Titan Slayers. The next two presidents are ineligible by virtue of losing on the presidential level on top of the ticket, and it's doubtful that there will be another Titan Slayer crowned in the immediate future. The incumbent vice president only ever ran in one other election, and most of the Democratic frontrunners have either never lost or are ineligible. Nevertheless, these men stand as reminders that everybody loses sometimes, and that losses are ultimately learning experiences so you can come back with more strength and strategy. Today's fish of the week is the sailfin poacher, Podoticus sachi, also known as the tokubire. These are stunningly beautiful fish, with gigantic colorful fins that jut out of their back half and dominate their side profile. These fish feed on crustaceans and worms they find on the seafloor.